All right, hello class. So this is going to be, oh, sure. All right, hello class. So this is going to be your YouTube video that is going to help you through the Obama economics assignment, which is going to be the first assignment part of your AP government and AP microeconomics review. So let me just share my screen right here. Actually, I don't want to open that. And kind of make explicit the instructions and what your assignment is. So you're going to read this article, so you can see the instructions right here on the screen. You're going to read the following excerpt from the New York Times Magazine article from 2008. So this New York Times Magazine article, some context why I picked it, it was written before Obama actually was elected president. So just shortly after he secured the Democratic nomination to become president in the United States. And it tries to sort of wrestle with or try to uncover what Obama's economic ideology is. And essentially, I guess the big takeaway or the big insight that I want us to develop from this activity is to be able to realize that prose, or the reason why we use graphs in AP microeconomics, is because it's graphs and models can tell more sophisticated stories in a more succinct and clear way than prose could, right? So although this article is very well written, wonderful knowledge about economic ideologies and how they change over time, very well communicated, and I think stands the test of time, because obviously this was written before Obama became president, but I think looking back on it as your AP government and AP microeconomics teacher, I think it really does help add a layer of context to the Obama presidency. But still, we can communicate these ideas with economic models, right? So essentially, we're going to be telling the story of Obama economics through models. And your model should support or challenge what we're going to discover is Leonhardt's, the author of this piece's thesis, which is, depending on how you look at it, a typo right there, Obama is both more left-wing and more right-wing than many people realize. All right, so we're going to review a little bit in a moment conservative economic ideology and liberal economic ideology. But one of the other things that I want to just stamp right at the beginning is that economic ideologies obviously change over time, and obviously mainstream conservative economic ideology and mainstream liberal economic ideology today looks different than it certainly did, a decade ago, and obviously several decades ago, so on and so forth. Okay. So your assignment is going to be essentially, you're going to draw one of four models, and I'm going to prompt you. I help you out a lot, right, throughout the essay. You're going to draw one of four models, economic models that we've developed in class, and you're going to see that I essentially helped you in the piece, right? There are parts of the piece where you can see these little boxes you should interpret as essentially boxes that sort of represent Mr. Diaz's thought process. So as an AP microeconomics teacher, what is the model that I'm picturing in my head? So here you can see the Lorenz curve. You can see the key to help you out. So the places I highlighted in green, I say that these places can be translated into a microeconomics model. And for the most part, I translate most of those pieces of prose into a microeconomics model, but not all of them. So leaving you some room to do some of the heavy lifting yourself and translate it into an economics model. Of course, your task is to translate the prose into the economics model, but then also tell me on the second column, as you can see here, on the second column, how has he interpreted this model? How has he used this model to help him develop his economic ideology and his policies? And explain how, or explain how the story Obama tells himself about this model supports Leonhardt's thesis that Obama is both more left-wing and right-wing than people realize, which is obviously a paradox, but a very interesting paradox. Okay, so I'm going to project this on the board. I'm going to have it handy, but you need to have it handy as I walk you through this. I'm obviously not going to read it word for word. That's, too much to ask. There are other ways that I help you too. Like in yellow, I highlighted ACT vocabulary words and I defined them in the footnotes. And also, those are going to be places where I pause in the YouTube video, some places, and highlight some of the stylistic techniques that Leonhardt uses to help convey his argument. In blue, I highlight AP government concepts / ideas. And check the footnote or pay attention to me when I talk in this YouTube video about the blue areas, because those are some important AP government concepts and ideas. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to have the piece projected here, but I'm going to just try to help you through this. You really have to have your own copy because I doubt you can see it. So the piece starts off and it says, as Barack Obama prepares to accept the Democratic nomination this week, it is clear that economic policies of next presidents are going to be hugely important. Ever since Wall Street bankers were called back from their vacations last summer to deal with the convulsions, meaning social upheaval and chaos in the mortgage market, the economy has been lurching from one crisis to the next. The International Monetary Fund has described the situation as the largest financial shock since the Great Depression. The details are too technical for most of us to understand. They're too technical for many bankers to understand, which is part of the problem. But the root cause is simple enough. In some fundamental ways, the American economy has stopped working. So I should start here by saying we are going to watch a documentary about the 2008 financial crisis at the end of the year, after we finish taking the AP Microeconomics exam on May 12th. And it's going to be called Inside Job, and it's about the 2008 financial crisis. It is a very hard event to understand, to explain. We're going to talk about subprime mortgage lending and the practices of investment banks and all that kind of stuff, and how this had a ripple effect throughout the economy. But for right now, we're just going to kind of use it as context to know that the economy had essentially stopped working as Obama was prepared to become president of the United States. I would also say too, to perhaps encourage you, take macroeconomics, right? If you really want to understand, more about governmental policies in terms of during recessions or governmental policymaking in general, or if you have an interest more in topics like employment and inflation, macroeconomics is the next course for you, and it can certainly provide you with more tools to better understand that first paragraph. But that's beyond the purview of this course right now. And then it continues, the fact the economy grows, that it produces more goods and services one year than it did in the previous one, no longer ensures that most families will benefit from its growth. For the first time on record, an economic expansion seems to have ended with family income having risen substantially. Most families are still making less after accounting for inflation, hey Isaac, than they were in 2000. For these workers, roughly the bottom 60% of the income ladder, economic growth has become a theoretical concept rather than the wellspring, a better medical care, a new car, a nicer house, a better life than their parents had. And so essentially, right, so these boxes right here, you should interpret them as Mr. D is reading this article, as he often does with a coffee in his hand, reading this newspaper article and picturing the economic model or graph that can tell this story, this prose story, more succinctly or more effectively than I think prose can. Right. So essentially, the last model that we've developed was the Lorenz curve. And I'm going to take these boxes because I know they're unclear, and I rewrote them on the board, and I'm going to explain these boxes, right? But let me just stamp, your task isn't, how does Mr. Diaz interpret these boxes, right? And there's not a lot of interpretation that I do with these boxes. It's how does President Obama interpret these boxes, right? And how do those interpretations allow us to gain insight into his economic ideology, and therefore sort of the economic ideology that was at least dominant during the Obama years. And so here we can see the Lorenz curve reproduced, right? And that statement that prose statement was talking about how there was economic growth, but for the most Americans, they did not enjoy that economic growth. And so the tool that we can use, right, to tell a story about income inequality in AP Microeconomics was the Lorenz curve, right? We said the Lorenz curve, that we have a line that the Lorenz curve gives us a visual representation, a graphical representation of income inequality in societies, and we can compare different Lorenz curves across countries or within countries, different segments of the country, to determine the amount of income inequality, or to give us a snapshot of the income inequality that exists there. And so on the y-axis of the Lorenz curve is the cumulative percentage of income, and then the cumulative percentage of the population, right? And then we draw a 45-degree line from the origin, which is going to be the line of equality, right? Line of perfect equality, I should say. Why is that the line of perfect equality? Well, at 50% of the cumulative percentage of the population, so meaning the bottom 50% of the population owns 50% of the income. At 5%, owns 5% of the income. So it means there's an equal distribution of income across society, perfectly equal distribution of income, right? This is obviously unrealistic. There's no society on the planet today that looks like this type of income distribution, but the Lorenz curve, which reflects the actual distribution of income, depending on how close it is to the line of perfect equality or how far away it is, we can gain insight into sort of the amount of income inequality that exists in society, right? And see, we can already tell like a more nuanced story with this graph than perhaps we did before. And this visual representation of it allows us to recall more easily, right? And so when we're reading newspapers in the future, maybe we can visualize this to think about these issues, right? And so essentially what the story is saying is that the income growth, or that the GDP, the economy was still growing from 2000 on, but the bottom 60% really didn't internalize any of that growth. And so for me, that represents a Lorenz curve that is shifted out further from the line of perfect equality than it was originally. Oops, let's pull a bit off. Right, so maybe this is an even new Lorenz curve, right? It's shifted out further, right? The income distribution is getting more and more unequal. Right, and to think about the income distribution further, right, or like the Lorenz curve, let's just imagine that the Lorenz curve isn't shifted out yet. All right, so what this shows is that in this society, the bottom 5% own what, like 0.5% of the wealth, the next 50% own like what, 15% of the wealth, and so on and so forth, right? And so if your economy is growing, but less of the people are sharing in that income, then we can think of this visually as a shifting out of the Lorenz curve in this society even further. We can also calculate a statistic. You're not going to actually have to calculate the statistic, but you just have to know what the significance of the statistic is, right? You're not actually have to draw out the Lorenz curves, but you just have to know the significance of the Lorenz curve for your AP Microeconomics exam. But we can calculate a statistic to think about income inequality in society. So the area, this is called the Gini coefficient. The area underneath the line of perfect equality and above the Lorenz curve is going to be the numerator. And then this right triangle from the line of perfect equality, and then I guess the base of this right triangle is going to be the x-axis on, is going to be the denominator, right? So the area A plus B. And then you should get a statistic, somewhere between 0 and 1. If you get 0, you're at perfect equality. And if you get 1, you're at perfect inequality. So let's think about why that is. Well, if you get 0, there's no distance. Like the area A, the Lorenz curve is just the line of perfect equality, right? So there's no area underneath the line of perfect equality and above the Lorenz curve. So 0 divided by anything is just 0, right? So that's perfect equality. And then let's think about why 1 would represent perfect inequality in this Gini coefficient. Well, think about it. A divided by a society where 1 where the Gini coefficient would equal 1, the Lorenz curve would look like this. Nobody at the bottom 99% of society would have anything. It would just be the last person would have all the wealth. That would be a perfectly unequal society. Well, in that case, A is the same as A plus B, right? Because this Lorenz curve is just shifted out, and A reflects the area above the Lorenz curve and beneath the line of perfect equality. They're the same, so the same numbers divided by itself is just 1, right? Obviously, those are two extremes, but it can help you think about income inequality in societies. Because the closer you are to 1, the more unequal the income distribution in society is. The closer you are to 0, the more equal the income distribution in society is. Now, this can tell a sophisticated story. It can tell a graphical story, and we have this calculation to be able to compare income inequality in society further, but it doesn't tell the whole story, right? We don't know about income mobility in this story. We don't know how mobile or how fast people's incomes change. We also don't know about the absolute well-being in the society. Like, if everybody has a high income, but there's just a lot of people that have an exorbitantly higher income, maybe we're okay with this amount of equality. But nonetheless, we can still tell a story with this. So let's move on. So then the story continues, and it talks about sort of long-standing problems that exist in American society in 2008. So today we're actually going to talk about healthcare markets a little bit more. We're also going to be talking about specifically Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act and sort of the market failures that it tries to address. But it talks about sort of, or it speculates about this demographic change in American society where an increasing percentage of our population is becoming older and qualifying for healthcare benefits like Medicare and Social Security. And that is putting great fiscal strain, budgetary strain on the United States, right? There's a lower percentage of people that are working compared to several. There's an increasing number. Our population is getting older and older and demanding more from the government, the state, right, in terms of the social or the legacy wealth, social programs that exist in our society, right? There's a larger dependent population that exists in our society, and therefore we should expect more government expenditures in our society geared towards medical costs, right? But we can. And so there's obviously great fiscal strain. The United States hasn't run a budget surplus since the 1990s when Georgetown graduate Bill Clinton was president of the United States. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem like we're taking concrete steps either in the form of raising taxes or cutting expenditures or reforming the medical system to become more cost efficient. All those different types of things, or tweaking sort of social programs that exist to become more cost efficient. Something meaningful to really address the fact that we've been running budget deficit after budget deficit, and we have, over $20 trillion in the national debt, right? So we can actually visualize it, and we can use a tool called, or a game theoretic tool called the prisoner's dilemma, which we've talked about in class before, to help us think about why this is, right? And so again, this is Mr. Diaz drinking his cup of coffee and ruminating and thinking about how economic tools can help him process this information. But we care more so about how Obama processed this information, which we don't know yet. So here we have two players in this game theoretic tool called the prisoner's dilemma. We have both Democrats and Republicans in this prisoner's dilemma. I have two players, Democrats and Republicans, and we can see they have two strategies. They can actively address the fiscal situation in the United States, or they can be passive and hope that the other party addresses the fiscal situation in the United States, right? And so we said the most complicated games we're going to wrestle with in this class are two by two games, right? We have a payoff matrix. This payoff matrix is interesting. The numbers in this payoff matrix represent the rank that players ascribe to the outcome. So you're trying to minimize it, right? You want to be at the best outcome possible, so possibly 1 or 2. The worst outcome for you, you definitely don't want to be at, which is outcome number 4, right? And so we can see that in this prisoner's dilemma, the way that we solve games in this class is we look for a dominant strategy solution, right? So we search for dominant strategies first. Dominant strategies are the strategies that do better against the other player compared to the other strategies. Or like, for example, a Democrat's dominant strategy would be a strategy that does better, right? So if passive is the dominant strategy, which we'll find out is, it should do better than active versus any other strategy that Republicans use, right? So, wait, no, it's a dominant strategy. Passive does better with these strategies, active and passive, compared to how active does with these strategies, right? And so the way that we can find dominant strategies, which are going to help us solve this game, is going to be, we compare, we make an assumption about which choice Republicans are going to choose. Let's just say active, and we can physically cover the column. And then we look, if Republicans choose active, what are Democrats going to choose? Well, 1 is greater than 2. Remember, the second number is the column players' payoffs. And so they're going to choose passive. Then if Republicans choose passive, well, 3 is greater than 4, or 3 is better than 4 in this case because they're ranking. So they're going to choose passive again. And so we realize that we have found a dominant strategy, and we only need one dominant strategy to be able to solve a game because we're going to assume that the other player is just going to play the best response to that dominant strategy. But let's go ahead and see if Republicans have a dominant strategy. Well, we see that they do, right? 1 is better than 2. If Democrats play active, Republicans would want to play passive, right? It's better, and then 3 is greater than 4. Now, let me just start off by saying the reason why these outcomes look the way that they do, or the reason why Democrats and Republicans probably like passive more than active, is because do you really want to be the political party that raises taxes or cuts spending on different programs that are popular? No, you would rather the other party do it, and that way you bear none of the political costs. But unfortunately, we end up in an outcome in which neither party does it, right? And we have, a great deal of fiscal and demographic problems in the United States that need to be addressed in some form, and we're in this square, right? This is the dominant strategy solution, right? Now, dominant strategy solutions are also what are called Nash equilibriums. Remember, we said Nash equilibriums are points at which each player is playing the best response to the other player, and it's a popular way to solve games is to find the Nash equilibrium. It just so happens that the dominant strategy is the Nash equilibrium in this game. But at Nash equilibriums, there's going to be hashtag no regrets, right? So what I mean by this is Republicans aren't going to regret their choice of choosing passive because Democrats chose passive, right? Because they're not going to say, oh man, I really wish I had chosen active. Well, they would end up at a worse outcome, right? There's no regrets here, right? Each player is playing the best response to the other player's strategy. That's what a Nash equilibrium is. All right, and of course, the rest aren't Nash equilibriums. And we've talked about ways we can solve prisoners' dilemmas by changing the payoff matrix, through contracts, other ways. There's ways to solve the prisoner's dilemma and to end up at because the prisoner's dilemma tells us that both parties are choosing rational strategies and ending up at a suboptimal outcome. There are ways to solve it, but we're not going to go over that in this review video. Okay. And so that was an interesting tidbit. So just go ahead and read that section, right? You're doing the reading on your own. And then it talks about John McCain. It says John McCain's economic vision as he laid out during the campaign amounts to a slightly altered version of Republican orthodoxy, with tax cuts at its core. Hello, Smith. What's up?
I'm just counting to see how many people are here. When you guys are in my class, or whatever class you're in, I'm going to give you the physical test. And then handwrite it to practice. I got paper now.
Got it. All right, so a Republican orthodoxy with tax cuts at its core. Obama, on the other hand, has more detailed proposals about a less obvious ideology. Right, so here's where we can kind of review the economic ideologies of these two political parties. So specifically, conservative economic ideology, and obviously it's changed over time, really from Reagan to before Trump, has been kind of more a laissez-faire economic ideology, meaning let the market run, get government out of the market. You may have good intentions, or but government, the famous saying from Ronald Reagan was, government is the problem, government isn't the solution to our problems. It was incredibly hostile to labor unions and legacy welfare programs like, obviously different transfer programs, different unemployment benefits programs, social health programs to some extent, and against progressive taxation, right? So we've talked about how we have a progressive taxation system in the United States, where the more money you make, the more in taxes you pay. At least we have a progressive income tax. Well, it used to be even more progressive prior to Ronald Reagan cutting the top income tax brackets by so much, right? They cut the top income tax bracket by a lot, but they also cut everybody else's taxes. But the top income tax bracket saw a dramatic cut in taxes in the Reagan years, and then that kind of has been one of the core policy planks of the Republican Party. If you want to know like the macroeconomics of that, come talk to me, or take a macroeconomics class. And then liberal economic ideology, I would even say with Carter, but really after World War II, I should have put that there, was government can intervene to positively affect people's lives, and especially the disadvantaged. It had an embrace of labor unions and the welfare state. Now, I will say that one of the elements that stays very strong with the Democratic Party is this idea about governmental intervention. It's just the ways and forms in which it takes. Now, I think due to longstanding trends of the weakening of labor union, or the lowering or decreasing unionization rates in the labor force, we have now seen a loss in power that labor unions in our society have historically had over the left-wing party, right? Over whatever the left-wing party tends to be, or the Democratic Party, right? I should also say too, like conservative and liberals, there used to be a time, now there's quite a deal of sorting, where there were several liberals and conservatives in the Democratic Party and several liberal and conservatives in the Republican Party, but that's getting us even more confused, right? So let me shut up. And this also stays pretty much for the most part prior to Trump, right? And this sort of hostility to labor unions to some, and welfare programs, but it kind of also doesn't, to some extent, it's kind of hard to pin down the conservative economic ideology, at least the one that I think Trump complicates it a lot. And we'll talk about why he complicates it so much in this video. Okay. Right, so it talks about how Obama has a less obvious liberal ideology, and then the second part becomes, well, before this point on the presidential calendar, it's usually clear where a candidate fits within the political spectrum of the party. With Obama, there's vast disagreement about just how liberal he is, especially on the economy. My favorite example came in mid-June, and it talks about a situation in which there are labor union federation that is super concerned about one of President Obama's economic advisors because they view him as too centrist. And then ironically, it also talks about how at the same time there was a op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal that had criticized him as being a departure from the Clintonian centrism and reversion to old liberal ways, so being this incredibly liberal figure. And so it kind of just underscores the point that Obama's economic ideology wasn't yet articulated, and there's political reasons for that, right? He was obviously incentivized to be a little bit coy about it, as are most people sometimes. And then it has this quote, right, this line, "My core economic theory is pragmatism," he said, "figuring out what works." And that's interesting, right? Because it is him being deliberately coy. And then we have the thesis highlighted in yellow. Depending on how you look at it, Obama is both more left-wing and more right-wing than many people realize, right? And then it goes into explaining this thesis statement. Then if we go into this page, right, it talks about how Clinton really kind of took the liberal, or how Clinton economic ideology and economic policies that he embraced, and not just economic ideology and policies, I would say on a range of social issues, really kind of took the Democratic Party and moved it to the right. Right? Ronald Reagan was this transformative political figure, a very popular political figure. There was a declining power and hold of labor unions over, the left-wing party. And since there are only two political parties, those, people on the furthest, or you're incentivized to move to the center, right, in a two-party system. That's what I should say. And so Bill Clinton moved to the center on a range of economic issues, was a fierce advocate of free trade. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was signed out under Bill Clinton on a variety of social issues, including criminal justice. Bill Clinton moved to the center. And so the piece kind of talks about that. Hey, Mr. Rivas, what's up?
Have you done it?
Oh, I'll do it right now. The job of a teacher, always getting interrupted. So let me narrate as I take attendance. So, okay. So right here, among policy experts and economists who make up Democratic government in waiting, there's now something of consensus. They agree that the deficit reduction did an enormous amount of good. It helped usher in the 1990s boom, and only period of strong, broad-based income growth in a generation. So Clinton's one of his, as I talked about earlier, he ended up balancing the budget deficit. But that boom also depended on a technology bubble and historically low oil prices. In the current decade, the economy has continued to grow at a decent pace, yet most families have seen little benefit. Instead, the benefits have flowed mostly to a small slice of workers at the very top of the income distribution, right? And so we can think about the Lorenz curve as telling a story with what's happening here in this prose. As Ruben told me, comparing the current moment in 1993, the distributional issues are obviously more serious now. From today's vantage point, inequality looks like a bigger problem than economic growth. Fiscal discipline seems necessary, but not sufficient. So there's kind of like a stereotype of Democrats as being like the tax and spend party. Well, the last president to run a budget surplus was a Democrat, right? So really showing how, I wouldn't say centrist this policy was, but this belief by Bill Clinton, that there needed to be a balanced budget in order to stimulate economic growth. That's more like a macroeconomic argument, which again, take AP macroeconomics. But definitely the idea itself seems to be a more centrist idea than a liberal idea, right? We can see, for example, the shift, right? I think what I'm also going to articulate, right, is how liberal the economic ideology espoused by Joe Biden is or has become, in the sense that he has essentially said, budget deficits, don't matter in the short run as long as you're making investments in, valuable, investments with, positive externalities and investments in public goods, as articulated by Janet Yellen. And budget deficits really don't matter as much in the short run. I mean, we should care about them, but not. He has a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. Okay, but anyways, so we can make this argument, right, with the Lorenz curve again, and then we can continue in the article. In practical terms, the new consensus means that the policies of the Obama administration would differ from those of the Clinton administration, but not primarily because of differences between the two men. The economy has changed in the last 15 years, and our understanding of economic policy has changed as well, Furman says. And that means that what was appropriate in 1993 is no longer appropriate. Obama's agenda starts not with raising taxes to reduce the deficit, as Clinton ended up doing, but with changing the tax code so that families making more than $250,000 a year pay more taxes and nearly everyone else pays less. That would begin to address inequality, right? So it's an interesting policy proposal to raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans and lower taxes on everyone else in the hopes of redistributing wealth through, tax policy, right? And then it continues, there would be ripe investments in the alternative energy, physical infrastructure and such, meant both to create middle-class jobs and address long-term problems like global warming, right? And so we can think about, use the tools of externalities to kind of explain this logic, right? And this is the first point where we can actually take a graph, right? This economic graph that tells this story, and then put it back into the graphic organizer and tell me how Obama would interpret this economic graph, right? How is he going to interpret this economic graph, and how does it support Leonhardt's thesis, right? So I'm going to take us to this side of the room. And then we have externalities, right, which is our type of market failure. And essentially, right, it talks about infrastructure investments, and there's current debates about what is even infrastructure. And I'm going to include in the article link in the description to put you towards these debates. But it talks about global warming, which is kind of one of those classic negative production externalities, or we can visualize it as a consumption externality as well. And remember, we said externalities are a type of market failure. Market failures, if there are no, or markets, if there are no market failures, usually produce the point, the allocated coefficient point, or the point where the social marginal cost curve and the, the social marginal benefit curve, private marginal benefit curve, social marginal benefit curve, and the social marginal cost curve intersect, right? They produce at that quantity. But an externality reflects that there's a gap between the private marginal cost curve and the social marginal cost curve, or there could be a gap between the private marginal benefit curve and the social marginal benefit curve, reflecting this idea that the parties in the transaction aren't the only ones internalizing the costs or the benefits of that transaction. And it's an example of a market failure. And so we can think of a negative production externality, right? A firm that is, or a group of firms that are polluting, right? Well, their private marginal cost curve associated with polluting is, to the right of the social marginal cost curve. The social marginal cost curve takes into account the marginal damage or the incremental damage associated with this firm continuing to be a polluter, right? It may be a polluter in the production process, or it may dump sludge down a river, or it may burn greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And so what we see here is that the market transaction, we see Q1 is produced, right, which is a higher quantity than Q2, but the socially optimal point of production would be lower, right? It would be at Q2, right? Because there's, this externality, right? The Earth is warming, climate change, and all that instances. And we can visualize that graphically, right? This story graphically about this overproduction using this graph. Right, there's a negative production externality associated with these firms that are burning fossil fuels or that are polluting in some form, not caring very much about the environment. right? And we can see the overproduction that is taking place. And the way in which, right, you can draw this graph in your graphic organizer, put it in the graphic organizer, but then your other task is tell me how President Obama interprets this graph, right? Well, obviously he wants to do something about this externality, right? He cares about climate change or global warming, and we'll talk about his climate change policies. We'll talk about the Paris Climate Accord and all that stuff next week. And he essentially wants to shift the private marginal cost curve to the social marginal cost curve, right? Which takes into account the marginal damage from pollution, right? And then it also talks about positive production externalities in some extent, like the investments in infrastructure. Infrastructure is interesting because they're not necessarily, like roads aren't necessarily public goods, right? Public goods are stuff that are excludable or non-excludable, meaning you can't exclude people from enjoying the benefits of it, and non-rivalrous. But toll roads are examples of roads being excludable. But governments we still should expect underproduction of goods where the benefits are not just internalized by the parties in the transaction, right? We should expect private markets to underproduce those goods, right? And so a positive production externality tries to push the private marginal cost curve or the social marginal cost curve closer together, right? And we can do this by, like with roads specifically, there are externalities to building roads, right? There are positive externalities to building roads. With education, there are positive externalities to gaining education, right? You become a more competent member of the workforce, right? You don't internalize all the benefits. Other people get the benefits of you being more competent and more educated, right? And so essentially, again, we can visualize this different ways. This can be a positive externality associated with road construction, right? And essentially you want to increase production, right? Because private markets alone underproduce them naturally because they aren't able to internalize all the benefits from it, or they visualize them as having a larger, or they have a larger private marginal cost than the social marginal cost. And so again, Obama's interpretation of this becomes, how can we expand production and bridge this gap, right? And you can do it through subsidies, cash payments. You can take care of negative externalities with taxation, which we'll see he does in the essay. Okay. Now we continue on. Yeah, so during the conversation, right, so the reporter had a conversation with Obama. He said he considered the deficit to be one of an array of long-term problems like global warming, healthcare, and the economic hangover that could follow the housing bust, all that types of things. Okay. So that's interesting, right? It's a prioritization of, unlike Clinton, not necessarily of the budget deficit, but of a range of different other problems that exist, like healthcare, global warming, all that. And then it says the new Democratic consensus is incomplete. Obviously, labor unions in particular perform more trade barriers than many other Democrats. During the primaries, Obama nodded and at times pandered in this direction. Okay, so then we can stop there. And we can think about this. So during the primaries, President Obama obviously had, there's an incentive for, because we have primaries, and we talked about this incentive in AP government before, to pander to your base in the primaries, right, to get the nomination, and then try to move center, right? So there was some pandering, it seems, by Obama towards labor unions that wanted stricter trade barriers, right? Wanted probably more protectionist policies. We've talked about protectionist policies with Trump, the Trump administration, and we did like an example, a comparative advantage example with the Trump administration. But let's visualize what this means here. And so hello. There's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and then I have 2 more coming. So 6, please. So what we can see here, right? We have the domestic steel market, and we can see that actually, and this is where I can provide some more informed context. President Obama becomes one of the biggest advocates for another free trade agreement called the Trans-Pacific Partnership that President Trump came out against, or then candidate Trump came out against in the 2016 election. And then Hillary Clinton triangulated and also came out against that trade deal, right? And so we'll talk about this using a game called a median voter game, right? Median voter, I think that's the appropriate term. But which essentially shows how political parties in a two-party system are incentivized, at least outside of the primaries in the general election, to rush towards the middle, right? Because nobody else is going to have a choice like on the left side of their flank, but they're going to have to vote for the candidate that is closer to their political ideology, right? And so Obama may have been pandering to these people that wanted more protectionist trade policies in the primaries, but then in the general election was more towards the middle. And then actually as president, was very much in favor of free trade and trying to negotiate a big trade agreement that, of course, the Trump administration, once President Trump got elected, rescinded. And so we can visualize protectionist policies through using the tools that we developed in Unit 2, right, of consumer and producer surplus, right? And so here's the domestic steel market, and we can see that the price in autarky might be higher than the world price, right? Because there may be more effective steel producers elsewhere. And what we can see here is that if this country were in autarky, meaning they didn't engage in free trade, or particularly with steel, then all of this purple surplus would be producer surplus, right? But instead we have this tiny little right triangle right here that represents producer surplus because we're engaged in free trade, and so the world price, which is lower than the price that the autarky price, allows for imports, and we can see that consumer surplus gains quite a bit, but producer surplus loses out quite a bit with free trade, right? And this gap between quantity supplied and quantity demanded is just going to be imported. And now more protectionist trade policies, how can you essentially pander to these different types of groups, not in terms of rhetoric, but in terms of policies, which is what we saw in the Trump administration, is to institute a tariff, right? We saw a whole bunch of tariffs in the Trump administration. Right? So the tariff would artificially inflate the world price, or we would have a new price for goods, considering the price of the tariff. Right, a new price of good, a higher price for goods, right? You would essentially artificially be inflating the price of imports, right, with the tariff. You would have tax revenue, government revenue from the tariff. You would have deadweight loss, right, a reduction in market transactions because you're distorting incentives with this tariff. But you can see that the domestic producer surplus gains significantly at the expense of consumer surplus. And we can see that social surplus is reduced because now we have deadweight loss, right? And so the story of the Democratic Party, especially in the Clinton years, which starts to, as the labor unions start to weaken, which really becomes a trend in the 70s, is a party that becomes more embracing of free trade. So Clinton, like I said, embraces NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. Obama, may have pandered, it seems, to, labor unions in the primaries, but as president certainly was not implementing any tariffs, and in fact was trying to negotiate the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a major free trade agreement. But what happens here is that this declining union power actually ends up opening a door for the likes of President Trump, because as candidate, he starting to peel off, right, to more left-wing voters by saying, hey, he uses very, dramatic rhetoric like China's raping us with trade. We have huge huge trade deficits. We import a significant amount more than we export. This is a huge problem. And he's really, sort of pandering to these constituencies and, of course, implements policies that do exactly this, right, with the tariff policies, et cetera. And essentially, he kind of sort of outflanks, so to speak, Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election and peels off. There's actually a phenomenon you can look up on. There are a lot of Obama voters that ended up voting for Trump, especially in the Rust Belt. And you would think that would be completely contradictory, but it was, for a variety of different reasons, but I would imagine one of these reasons was positions on trade. Okay. Finally, then it goes on, right? It talks about in the third section, a University of Chicago Democrat. So shout out to Angel for getting into Chicago. Good job, my friend. And it talks about how the University of Chicago has become kind of like the intellectual center for economic conservatism. So specifically, right, Milton Friedman was an economist there. It talks about how it became like sort of the staging ground for laissez-faire political philosophy or economic philosophy and all that stuff. And then the article talks about how the Chicago School was right about a variety of different things, about the power of markets. It says here, it is in a market system, prices adjust when there's a shortage or glut, and the problem soon resolves itself. Just as important, companies constantly compete with each other, which helps bring down prices, improves the quality of goods, and ultimately lifts living standards. Right, so we can see in this paragraph too that the market, it's a very interesting mechanism, right? We didn't get a chance to read Adam Smith in this class, but I certainly did read it for my AP World History class, and I'm sure you guys have read it before. But markets really, private markets really harness the power of greed to produce and maximize social welfare. Absent market failures, that's what they do, right? That's the first welfare theorem of economics, that markets, are able to maximize social welfare, absent market failures. And so we can see in picture 5, right? Oh, I forgot to say, right? So you could draw these graphs in your graphic organizer and then explain how Obama would interpret them. And he would say, nope, not a good idea, right? Which is probably, consistent with, economic outlook about, protectionist policies, but certainly, has some political consequences associated with it. Okay, so allocative efficiency. So markets produce at the allocatively efficient point. We maximize social welfare, assuming no market failures and assuming a perfectly competitive market setting. Right? We saw instances with the monopoly model, the monopsony model, where you can still get dead weight loss, essentially not the maximum amount of social surplus because of different types of market settings, right? Non-competitive market settings, etc. But markets have this power where they can produce at the allocatively efficient point, right? Assuming perfect competition and no market failures. And that's the point at which the marginal benefit curve or the demand curve, right? Because we can think of the demand curve as the marginal benefit curve, and the supply curve or the marginal cost curve intersect. Right? They produce at the allocatively efficient point. It means that whatever price this is, the quantity exchanged, everybody that values it at this price and higher is going to get this good. Right? It's allocative efficiency. Now, if you intervene in this type of market setting, you might have a different price that consumers might think is more optimal to them, but you could potentially have, so for example, if you had a price ceiling right here, you'd have a quantity demanded that is much greater than the quantity supplied. This is QD, much greater than the quantity supplied, and so you're not producing an allocative efficiency, right? There are going to be people that want this good, that value it at the price that is set, that are not going to get it, right? And so this is kind of a powerful intuition behind the power of free markets in society. Of course, there are limits to free markets with market failures and all that type of stuff. And then in 6, I talk about too, because it talks about the benefits of competition in the article. And so we've introduced this model before, right, where there are profits, right, and this assume the market setting of perfect competition, right, where there are profits, so we can see profits, we go from the intersection of marginal cost and price in this perfectly competitive model, all the way down to the ATC curve and across, this equals the profits. There's going to be firms that want to enter the market, right? Even in profits in which there are huge barriers to entry, because remember we assume no barriers to entry in this type of model, there's still going to be firms that want to enter the market. So we can show this as a rightward shift of the supply curve and essentially a lowering of price, assuming a constant cost industry. Right, so we see a lowering of price, and we see the price actually in this industry is going to be tangential to the minimum ATC curve. And that's going to be the productively efficient quantity produced. Now, this is a powerful model because it also shows that increasing competition forces firms to minimize costs and to produce at their cost minimizing output level. Right, and so this is beneficial to consumers for a variety of competing firms. And it's kind of the intuition by trying to increase competition in marketplaces. And so Obama seems to like, right, you could put he likes. He doesn't like this, he likes this. But nonetheless, his governmental policies are going to be focused more on market failures like climate change in the works. Okay. Almost done. Right, it talks about pollution again, which you can visualize as externalities. Then it talks about healthcare. We'll talk about his healthcare program next week, right? Adverse selection and all that good types of stuff. It talks about healthcare. And then it talks about cap and trade, and then actually auctioning off tradable permits for pollution, right? And so we're not going to get into that debate. That's something you have to read. But essentially, one way you can think about this is that one way he's handling this externality is effectively he's shifting the marginal cost curve. Actually, his climate policies become different because, of course, Republicans would sweep in the 2010 midterm election. So he would have to use executive action to get really any of his policies, domestic policies, enacted, and in fact turn more to foreign policy after 2010. But essentially, you're shifting the marginal cost curve of these firms up, right? So this is a firm, and effectively, what you're doing to supply, right? Any policy where you're trying to essentially tax or add a per unit cost to a, in this case, a polluter, right? You're essentially shifting the supply curve to the left, right? And forcing less production to take place, right? Because you're effectively making the firm's marginal cost curve increase. So we'll talk about his climate policies next week. And again, we're using just Obama as a reference point for all of these types of things. And we could see, okay. And then finally, in the section that says spreading the wealth, there are so many models that you can draw with the spreading the wealth example. Or not the spreading the wealth example. It says Obama didn't name them all, but a decent list of like different types of dynamics that are contributing to sort of the economic insecurity and economic disaffection that a lot of people, and social disaffection a lot of people are experiencing then, and I would argue still now, are new technologies that have made some blue-collar jobs obsolete, a slowing in the nation's educational attainment, the shriveling of labor unions, the increase in one-parent families, which are far less economically secure, and the rise of other countries that have huge low-wage workforces. So there's so many models you can draw. You can draw labor markets. You can show how the drop in the power of labor unions has allowed for this, or maybe you can make a claim that it's allowed for this drop in wages. The rise of low-skilled workers all across the world have made sectors in this economy sort of irrelevant. We can draw protectionist trade policy models again. There's so many political ways in which people have tried to exploit these phenomenons that exist in our society. And then it finally talks about Reagan tax brackets. And I guess that's where I'll leave us. Yeah, it talks about Reagan tax brackets. And it says, it's helpful to start with a little history. When Reagan was elected in 1980, tax rates on top incomes were so high that even liberal economists now say that the economy was suffering. There simply wasn't enough of an incentive for rich people to start new companies or expand existing ones because so much of their profits would have gone to the federal government. Right, so it talks about Reagan tax policies. And so we can think about tax policies as essentially a tax, right? We visualize what a tax would do. So this is just a random labor market, but let's say we taxed labor, right, and they keep increasing rates. So essentially what the tax would do is it would shift the supply curve to the left, right? This is an example of a per unit tax. So this is S plus the tax. Because effectively what it does is it drives a gap between the wage that workers receive and the wage that firms actually pay, right? There's this gap that exists between them, right? There's a gap between the wage that the workers receive and the wage that the workers actually pay. And then there's a whole bunch of tax revenue that comes from this gap. But presumably, right, here's the producer surplus. And remember, in labor markets, the producer surplus are workers. This is producer surplus. And then here, up here's the consumer surplus, right? So the government intervention creates deadweight loss because essentially it lowers the price of leisure, right? If you're not able to keep more of your income and you're just getting taxed from that income, more and more people are going to be disincentivized to work. And this is the sort of trade-off that is inherent to taxation. You still need taxes to potentially do stuff like rectify market failures or produce public goods. I mean, that would be smart economic policy. And you probably still need taxes to conduct your dumb economic policy. But, there's a trade-off inherent to them. So the piece talks about how high the taxation rates were before Reagan, and that his lowering of taxes probably did some good and incentivized more people to work. But Obama's interpretation of this is important too, right? And in some ways, it's kind of an interesting interpretation. Where's my Obama picture? Because he ends up raising taxes on the top income earners and then lowering taxes on everyone else during the Obama years, which puts him in, makes him distinct from what Clinton did, which was raise taxes on everyone to handle the budget deficit. Okay, so this is Obamanomics. Put those models, tell the story of Obamanomics. Tell me how Obama interprets these models or how you think he interprets these models from the reading. That's the assignment. Man, I'm tired.